So hello, my name is DRYAN, and I am a student here at Liberty University, COM 520, and I'm going to be doing a presentation today on the narrative paradigm. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to have to say it's been a heck of a day for me. Yesterday I found out I had to fly out to Hawaii for some last-minute military work stuff. So here I am. I'm actually recording this from my hotel room on base, and it's been kind of a long day on the airplane, and hopefully I can get through this and I can teach you something about my research project, which was on the narrative paradigm. So the narrative paradigm was developed by Walter Fisher in the 20th century, and it basically focused on the fact that human beings are natural storytellers. Everyone likes to tell a story, and Fisher believed that meaningful communication actually takes the part of these stories, and that we can actually learn something from listening to these stories. Now, I chose this topic because by trade I'm a military journalist, so writing stories and telling other people's stories is really important to me. Also, on the civilian side, I'm a creative writer. I'm also working on a book, Stories of Growing Up in Rural Oklahoma. So I'm very interested in storytelling and the narrative paradigm, and to see if if it truly is an effective way to communicate. So Fisher's narrative paradigm basically required two things. One was narrative coherence, and the other is narrative fidelity. So when he talks about narrative coherence, basically what he's saying is the level of the story. Does that level of the story make sense to the people that are hearing it or observing it? Are there no surprises at the end? Does it follow like a logical order? And then the second part, narrative fidelity, is basically the degree to which the story fits into the observer's prior understanding of the topic, or does it go along with their morals and values and their sense of right or wrong. Okay. For this research project, I chose two research questions that focused on the narrative paradigm. The first question was, is the narrative paradigm more prevalent in minority groups when compared to mainstream society? And the second question was, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the use of storytelling an effective tactic when you're trying to achieve strategic communication goals within certain groups? Now, I chose these two questions because I'm personally very interested in the effectiveness of storytelling, hopefully to change hearts and minds and to achieve strategic communication goals. So we were tasked with performing a literature review, which I did for this topic, and I did it online. I used Google Scholar. I also used databases available for the National University Library and a few other online sources. I performed those searches using keywords, and the keywords that I used and keywords and phrases were Walter Fisher, the narrative paradigm, minority groups, storytelling, homosexuals, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. Now, because I was targeting the narrative paradigm and storytelling to each of those minority groups that I just mentioned, not all the articles and the literature that I chose contained all of those words, but they contained some of those words. So, moving into our first minority group for this study was the homosexual group. So basically, there wasn't a lot of research available on the specific topic for the homosexual minority group, and I wasn't able to find any evidence that the narrative paradigm was actually more prevalent in the homosexual community than in mainstream society. Now, one thing that I did find is that there was actually evidence that storytelling was an effective way to get personal narratives to both homosexual audiences and straight audiences as well. Now, primarily, the research that I found was that these stories and narratives were in the fight for equality, the fight for same-sex marriage, and that was, of course, from the Davis study that I had found. Moving on to the second minority group that I studied was the African Americans. Now, in the research that I uncovered in my study, I didn't find any quantified evidence of prevalence, but there was a lot of assumed prevalence due to personal narratives about the civil rights movement. Now, the works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. kept coming up in my literature review, so this kind of became a constant focus area for my research with his storytelling and his use of personal narrative. Now, we've probably all heard of his I Have a Dream speech. There's also the letter from the Birmingham jail and lots of other stuff for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when it comes to personal storytelling. And of course, he was trying to make the world a better place and help with the civil rights movement by asking folks to take part in nonviolent protests. So he was definitely using his personal stories and the narrative paradigm to achieve those specific strategic goals. I was also able to find several examples of modern storytelling to help achieve the African American story. Some of these were about Olympic athletes and things like that. So I basically came to the conclusion that the African American community definitely does use storytelling in the narrative paradigm, and it does appear, though maybe not quantifiable, that it does seem to be effective. The next minority group that I looked into was that of Hispanic Americans. Now, this one was very interesting because I actually found some studies that showed that storytelling is more prevalent in Hispanic American households than mainstream society, and that storytelling was used to both entertain and educate. I also found that storytelling was not just a parent to a child event, it involved the whole family. So grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, lots of things that went on in the Hispanic household when it dealt with storytelling. Now, I was able to find some evidence that showed how storytelling was an effective tool to achieve strategic communication goals. This was in the Briggs, Herrera-Sobek, Mariscal, and even in the Reese studies. And these two studies focused primarily on healthcare, but they were obviously trying to achieve some strategic communication goals when it came to health promotions and teaching people about their bodies and how to take advantage of healthcare programs. So I was able to determine that there was definitely some evidence in the Hispanic American community about the effectiveness of storytelling. The next minority group that I studied was the Native American group, and once again, I really liked what I found. Now, I didn't find any quantifiable evidence, once again, based on studies that storytelling was more prevalent in Native American society. But actually, I take that back. I did find evidence that it was more prevalent. Storytelling was used to both entertain and to educate the young in the Native American community. And oral tradition is very important to the Native American community. And again, I was able to find evidence showing that storytelling was able to achieve some strategic communication goals in that specific minority group. Again, the studies were on healthcare. Moving on to Asian Americans, I didn't find any evidence that storytelling was more prevalent in the Asian American community, but I did find several examples of storytelling. A lot of things focused on Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, and also I found some personal narratives about athletes, Apollo Ono, the skater, so that was very interesting to see that as well. So basically, conclusion, I found that the narrative paradigm in storytelling is definitely more prevalent in Hispanic and Native American minority groups than in mainstream society. The narrative paradigm in storytelling may also be prevalent in African American, Asian American, and homosexual minority groups, but definitely need some more research in that area before we can make that conclusion. And of course, in the Native American and Hispanic American groups, I was able to find evidence that storytelling and the narrative paradigm did help to achieve those strategic healthcare, strategic goals, primarily in healthcare. So this pretty much concludes my study. Did a lot of references, which I'll show here on the slides. Does anyone have any questions?